Hey everyone, Mark here. Welcome to Bumbling Through Dungeons, the show where we talk about D&D and fudge, or in this video, fudging rolls. So this is a potentially contentious subject, but I don't think it needs to be. And I want to walk through some considerations for fudging rolls when you are a DM behind the DM screen. Let's get into it. So, the reason people don't like fudging rolls, hopefully, is pretty obvious. It's because you need trust between the DM and the players when you're playing. And if the result of an encounter seems falsified, seems like it was arbitrarily determined not by a dice roll but by the DM, then you lose a little bit of agency. It feels like you lose a little bit of agency as a player. So you need to be very, very careful with this. And I'll say right off, if in doubt with most groups, don't fudge your rolls. I do think there are a few very limited cases where I would and where I have, but they're so limited so as to maintain that trust with players. And I want to talk through those today. And I think once I talk about the different places where I would fudge rolls, you'll see that it's not something that session to session with my regular group that they're ever having to really worry about. So there are people out there who will say you should never fudge rolls. And I think in some groups that's true. So if you've been playing with a group for a long time and they want the consequences of their actions and the consequences of their dice rolls, then you should just not fudge rolls. And with my regular group that I play with, I don't. So there's been one exception to that, and it was a very particular circumstance, and I'll talk about it. But I just don't fudge rolls with the groups that I DM with. But it's because we're all regular players and we all understand what's going on at the table. Which leads me to the first couple reasons that I would fudge rolls. The first is with brand new players. So I've DM'd some one-shots where you've got regular players and then you've got people playing for their first time. And they might not pick up on the same clues that a regular player would about what's dangerous or what should or shouldn't be done. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that if someone's coming in and playing D&D for the first time and they don't have a great time, that might be it for them forever. Now, maybe nothing I do as a DM is going to make or break their experience. And maybe their character could die and they'll still have a great time. But if their time gets cut short and I just do the killing blow on them and they are gone, I say, sorry, you're out of the session. Nice playing with you. And this is their very first experience with D&D. I think there's a very real possibility that that could be it for them. And I don't necessarily want to be the person who is responsible for that. So I'm trying to help people enjoy their time in the hobby, understand what it's about. And I don't think you need to experience every single aspect of the game, including character death, on your very first play. Now, if someone came to the table and said, hey, I want the consequences of my actions. If something happens and I'm going to die, go ahead and kill me. Then, all right, cool, I would do that. But I haven't had to fudge dice rolls with new players. But if I rolled a crit and it would one-shot them, kill them, something like that, they're playing a level 1 intro one-shot, I would probably soften that blow a little bit so that it maybe just knocked them out instead of killed them outright and let the other players help them out. So there are a lot of ways you can massage an encounter to let that happen. So I've run plenty of one-shots where that's not the case and I'm not fudging rolls at all. But if I had a brand new player, it would be a consideration. And frankly, I think it would be okay in that situation. The second is somewhat related, and that's with children. So if you're playing a game with kids, you can get very invested in your character. This is true of adults. People cry when their characters die that they've been playing for months or years and gotten heavily invested in. And you might not be ready for that if you're playing with kids, or the kids might not be ready for that if they're playing and they haven't experienced it yet. So I've seen a lot of different ways to handle this with children when you're running a game and they're playing with it. And I think probably how I would do it, I've DM'd for kids, but I've never DM'd a campaign to the point where we might have to deal with character death. I think how I would deal with it and how some of my friends have dealt with it is that you start to introduce the concept slowly. So it gets referenced. Someone off camera a while ago died at the hands of this villain. So you put it out there as a possibility, but not for the players themselves. And then you start to build up toward it slowly, and it depends on the maturity of the kids It depends on their age level. It depends on how long they've been playing. It depends on what you know about them personally. There are a lot of very specific factors that go into this. But eventually you work up to an NPC death that happens in the scene. So the players are there for it. They get to witness it and they realize that this is possible for people in the world. So that makes it a little bit more real for them. You might even have an out of character discussion with them saying, hey, we've seen this happen, have a little talk about it, and then talk about their characters and that possibility to gauge their thoughts on it. It's something that I would work toward. But if I'm playing for the first time with kids, they're playing for the first time and they're facing off against a tough threat, no, I'm not going to deal the killing blow when we can soften that a little bit and allow them to get used to the game first. So I think that's the second time where, even more so than with new players, I would be very careful about being too brutal. So the last time that so the first two are very conceptual because I've never actually had to fudge dice rolls for them. I think that I would consider it. I think that I would feel okay if I had to, but I haven't had to this point in my DMing career. The third example, the only other time that I can come up with where I might consider it and where I have, is when an encounter is deadly, but it's because of a mistake that I made as a DM. So this was a conversation that I had with the first group that I ever ran with. So I was DMing my first campaign. It was homebrew, and I said right up front, like, you're going to take the consequences of your actions. I want death to be present in this campaign. They were all on board with that. And I said the only time where that might not be the case is if I screw something up and an encounter is very much less fair than what I intended. So as I was learning to DM, that was me giving myself a little bit of leeway, because as I started to build encounters, there was eventually a point where I created an encounter that was intended to be a relatively easy encounter, but I calculated a number of things incorrectly, and it became an encounter that probably would have resulted in a TPK. And it was because I had misunderstood certain mechanics within the game. So it was my error, and I didn't want to punish my players for that. So I think at this point, because I understand the mechanics of the game well enough and I've developed encounters enough, that I don't think I would encounter that problem again. I don't think that would come up again in play. But I was a new DM and I was learning sort of by trial and error in this campaign, and that was definitely one of my big errors. So it was the only time where I sort of pulled back in a number of ways, not just with the dice rolls. Like, there were a couple narrative things I did where, like, I took some enemies out of it, and it was because I realized, oh, well, this isn't anything like I envisioned or intended, and I don't actually know if what I created is the correct difficulty level for what was intended here. There were plenty of other fights in the campaign that were intended to be potentially deadly for the players, and a couple that actually killed players. They were able to be resurrected, but we did have player death, or player character death, I should say. But that was the one fight where I pulled my punches, and I don't want to have to do that, and I don't think it's ideal, but I think given the circumstances surrounding it, that it was the correct choice. So I use those three examples not to tell you here's when you should fudge dice, but to give you considerations so that you can make that determination on your own. I don't think there are wrong answers for some of these situations. I think as long as you're being open and communicative with your group, and you're also taking into account all the different factors, both in-game and out of game, like in the case with kids or a brand new player, that if you come up with a decision that you are happy with, that you're content with, there isn't a right or wrong answer of should I fudge these dice rolls. There are still going to be people who say, nope, never fudge a dice roll, and if that works for them and their group, that's great. And again, with the groups I run with these days, I don't have to worry about that. No one's fudging dice rolls. No one wants anyone to fudge dice rolls. But say I move to a different city or get married and have kids and I'm playing with them, then the circumstances change and my answer to the question may change. So it's less about what's right or wrong so much as what's right or wrong for you and the groups that you play with. And these are the times where I could see myself fudging a dice roll, but it's still going to be very, very sparingly. And I think that's as it should be, because one of the best things about the game is the uncertainty that dice rolls bring. And I always want to experience that when I'm playing, whether it's as a DM or as a player. So, regardless of when you do or don't decide to fudge your rolls, I trust it will be the best decision for you and your group, and I hope this has given you a few things to consider, at least, as you get more into DMing. But until next time, take care. All right, check this out. See, there's arms in this picture, so I gotta put them up. But then when I do, yeah, I think it looks cool. Anyway, subscribe